Well, thank you, Andrew, for that very fulsome introduction. As I say, we've enjoyed working together for a long time, so I'm very pleased to be here tonight to talk about one of those projects. It was just before, it was 20 years ago, I started the London Festival of Architecture in 2004 in Clerkenwell here, supported by Alan Baxter. And but the year before, I just completed a book called The Saga of Sydney Opera House. And so I wrote a lot about some of the issues that came together in delivering the Opera House. But also I thought, because this is Docomomo, I'd talk this evening about that, but also about what has happened since then to actually protect, you might say, the legacy of Utzon and ensure that work that is done to the building in the future is done to the right sort of standard. So my subtitle is All's Well That Ends Well, because it was a very fractious design and construction period, but today everybody is our friends. So as you heard from my career, I hadn't had much to do with the Sydney Opera House before I started writing the book. So you might say, well, why did you write the book? And it's because this chap, who is Sir Jack Zuntz, when we met at the opening of the Great Court of the British Museum in December 2000, he was then chairman of Arup and had been since 1977. But in 1960, he had been put in charge of the engineering of the Opera House by Ove Arup. And when we were talking at the British Museum, he was very angry. He was angry because a film called The Edge of the Possible, which had actually been filmed in 1998, so sometime after the end of the construction of the Sydney Opera House, and it quoted Utzon about having solved all the issues around the engineering of the building. And one of Utzon's architects is recorded as saying, Arups didn't like it because Utzon found the solution after the engineers struggled for years to solve it. The engineers had tried, but Utzon changed the engineering into spheres and solved it himself. And so the story is in a sort of eureka moment. He was in his bath in his studio in Hellebæk in Denmark, and he dropped an orange into the bath and it created a ring around it, which was the solution to this circular design for the studio. And that was actually rubbish, and I'll tell you more about that as I go through the story. And so Jack saw it very differently, and he said to me, so well, you can write it as you see it, but we'll at Arup make available to you all the files which we locked away in 1973 and never showed anyone because they actually felt very protective of Utzon's reputation. And so I owed to Jack that he asked me to do that. The files were made available, and they were fascinating to go through because, of course, that was before the days of emails or chat or anything like that. And you had to book up phone calls a day in advance. They weren't very good. It cost as much to fly to Sydney as a 3-bedroom house in those days. And so people wrote letters, and I have to say they wrote wonderful letters. I mean, as sort of engineers, you think their letters are going to be slightly, stolid, perhaps in style, but actually Jack Zuntz and other members of the Arup team really wrote very elegant, descriptive letters, and towards the end, very angry ones. Quite a few letters from Ove Arup when things started to go around, which was so angry that he didn't actually send them. So I thought probably it was unwise to publish him in the book. So it's a fascinating story, a story about one of the most amazing and successful in the long run, successful buildings in the world, and but a lot of pain and anguish went into delivering it. So Utzon won the competition for the building in 1957. He was 38. His entry was 218 out of 222, so he was fifth to the last. So that might have given him some hints about his delivery skills. But it arrived really a fairly rough drawing, and this was his one of his key drawings, and was described at the time by the art critic Robert Hughes as nothing more than a magnificent doodle. And so it was then up to others to actually make it work as a building, because up until that time he had only his two major projects were housing schemes at King Co on the right and Friedensburg on the left. Really nice housing schemes, still very good today, great quality construction, repetitive elements. So, I mean, not a incredibly difficult project to deliver. Deliver with great skill, well built, but design-wise, fairly straightforward to build. And he says he was inspired by Hamlet's castle at Kronborg, and this was where he was inspired by the idea of having a building with a clear profile, because Kronborg sits out on a promontory, very similar to Sydney. And it also has this very powerful profile, which he wanted to emulate, but in a different way. And he was very keen on the idea of the fifth facade, i.e. the roof was a very important part of the view of the building as it sits in Sydney Harbour, which people describe, the water is the central square of Sydney, and like most squares, the main buildings face out onto that square. And this is the site that was chosen for Bennelong Point. It was chosen for the Opera House. Now, one of the important things to note is that it is a long and fairly slim site, and this is very important in terms of understanding some of the issues around design and to a certain extent what went wrong. And so these are the judges looking at Utzon's scheme. As you can see, it's a shell structure, as was very fashionable at the time. On the left is Henry Ashworth, and he was the representative of the Sydney Opera House Organising Committee as one of the judges. And then you have Eero Saarinen on the right. You have Cobden Parkes, who's the government architects, and then further to the right is Leslie Martin. And Leslie Martin, of course, had only 6 years earlier designed and delivered the Royal Festival Hall very successfully. And Saarinen was a bit late on the judging. Nobody's quite sure whether this story is true, but it says he turned up and he went through the reject pile and found Utzon's drawing, and he pulled it out and he said, this is your winner, and the others agreed with him. And I was reading Peter Carolyn talking about Leslie Martin not long ago. Said that he used to recall Samuel Alexander's suggestion that the mass of architecture, with its link to practical purpose, should be the same as good prose writing, while the rest, designed for less common purposes, might be regarded as poetry. And I think that's very interesting in terms of the way you differentiate between those special buildings in cities and what he calls the massive buildings, but also because Harry Seidler, when he was defending Utzon towards the end of the project, he also used poetry as his description of why Sydney Opera House was so great. Now, one of the really important things about this building is that when he designed it, he took no engineering advice at all. And so he designed it in shells. Shells were the trendy thing to be doing at that time. They're sort of cutting edge. But he made a couple of fairly substantial errors in his drawings, which if he'd had an engineer, he wouldn't have done. First of all, they landed at a point which creates enormous stress at those points. You can see all those points as they go down the base structure. And also their curvature increased towards those supports, which created massive bending moments. So they would have just panned out and collapsed. But of course, it was possible to build buildings a bit like that. And other people had been doing it. And so you've got Felix Candela, engineer, a designer, and a constructor, and he was building these all over Mexico and Valencia and so on, quite happily and successfully, and a lot of them are still standing today. Then there's Kresge Auditorium on the right at the top at MIT. Saarinen did that himself. That started construction in 1953. Bottom left is the Smithfield Poultry Market. We can see it from the top of this building. That was done in 1963. Bryn Mawr by Architects Co-Partnership, 1951 that was. And those two buildings, the Poultry and Bryn Mawr, the engineer was Ronald S. Jenkins, who was Arup's expert in shell structures, with the rather appropriate initials of RSJ. And now the building on the far right at the bottom is very interesting. I discovered this in Tallinn, Estonia, and it's a museum for seaplanes, and it was actually built to house seaplanes, but it was built actually in 1917. So everyone, the first three first four pictures you see, everyone thought they're cutting edge, but actually the Danes actually had done it some 50 years before, 40 years before, because that was actually built by Christiani and Nielsen, Danish company, who OBE Arup had actually worked for at some stage. So it may well have been that OBE Arup was aware of that building. And so you can sort of see why Iro Saarinen liked Utzon's solution, because the TWA building, this building, that opened in 1962. And in 1957, when he was judging the Sydney Opera House, he was working on this. And actually, there are quite great similarities between the forms that Utzon came up with and the forms here. So you can see that when Saarinen pulled it out of the reject pile, he obviously felt that Utzon was onto something. But one of the key issues was rather pragmatic, really, and this is the scheme which came third place by Boisseveen and Osmond, English practice. Paul Boisseveen, he was Dutch, but he practiced really in London for a long period of time. They won third prize. This is a digital reconstruction of what they proposed, which was produced just a few years ago. It wasn't part of their actual presentation at the competition. You can see in the more recent buildings in the background. But I spoke to Paul Boisseveen because he was still alive when I was writing the book. And he looked. He said Utzon's scheme was brilliant, but fatally flawed. And the fatal flaw, as he saw it, was that he had put the two halls that had to be built as part of the opera house along the jetty, whereas, as we'll see, Utzon put them side by side. So side by side, end by end. So side by side did have its dangers and were one of the key issues that Utzon had to solve. So this is his solution of the base, and you can see it the two theatres side by side. There's the main concert hall, and then an opera house at the top of the slide. And these are basically sort of Greek theatre in style, because he built this large base onto which the shells were to be put. And as a Greek theatre, he sort of scooped the shape of the theatre itself out of that, and then provided access to the seats via, you can see the three staircases either side of the scooped areas. And so it was the staircases also provided a lot of issues for Utzon because it constrained the width that he had to play with in delivering the number of seats. So that base, it's 95 meters from right to left, so 95 meters long, but it rose 25 meters above the water. So there's obviously that rise of the seating leads you up to that back with the glazed area that is so frequently photographed. So the brief was to provide in the larger hall, and this is important, it was for concerts, large-scale opera, ballet, dance, choral, pageants, and mass meetings. And then in the small hall, it was going to be dramatic presentations, intimate opera, chamber music, recitals, and lectures. So that was the brief that was given to Utzon, and that's what he aimed to deliver. Then Utzon had been advised, because he had not consulted an engineer in producing his competition scheme, he was advised to contact somebody who would help him, and he was advised to contact either OBE Arup, here in the picture, or Christiane Nielsen, another Danish company well-versed in constructing shell structures. But OBE Arup got in there first. He wrote a letter very quickly after Utzon was announced as the winner of the competition, something that in those days was actually against the code, both for architects and for engineers. So it was he was touting, really highly unprofessional, but he wrote it in a rather sentimental way that we're both Danes and we could work together and solve the problem. And so Utzon was quite pleased to work with him, and they worked together for a number of years, and engineers within Arup described it rather sort of father and son relationship, very close and very successful for a time. Now, the actual construction of the whole complex was split into three parts. There was a base which Utzon had been inspired by Mayan architecture, this sort of large decking which covers the site, and then on top of that went the sails, the shells, and then the third phase were the interiors. And but one of the things that had to happen was that the project had been championed by Joseph Cahill, who was then the president of New South Wales, and he was ill, and he wanted to get on with it because he saw it as his legacy, really. The other legacy he has, which still exists, and I don't think they've taken it out yet, but Cahill Expressway running through the centre of Sydney is probably the one that, because of his name attached to it, people recognise as his legacy. But he was keen to get going with it, and even on his deathbed, he instructed the minister, a chap called Norman Ryan of Public Works, to ensure that the Sydney Opera House got built, because there had been quite a lot of debate in Sydney about its cost and whether it was needed and whether hospitals were more important. The sort of debate that happens with large projects everywhere, actually, that better things to spend this money on. So the base was then started construction, and it started construction before the shells were fully designed. And so that started to spell trouble. But at this stage, OBE Arup and Utzon were working very well together, and this was enthused Utzon enormously, and OBE Arup was very proud of it. He actually designed the structure of the undercroft, which is a large area underneath that base, and to reduce the number of columns, OBE Arup designed this special beam which moves from a sort of T type shape beam to a U, and in doing so creates this rather elegant shift in the structure, which Utzon was very pleased about, and he said to OBE that this is your concourse, which later we'll see was quite an interesting thing for him to say. But at that stage, as I say, they were working together like father and son. Arup believed that in Utzon he had found, you might say, the perfect architect with whom to collaborate. His personal quest for total architecture, which is an approach which still today promulgated within the Arup organization, is an approach that dissolved the disconnect between engineers and architects, something that he really sought the whole of his career, not always successfully. Arup Associates was set up to deliver that, but that's now been merged back into the main engineering company. But the idea of total architecture, where all the various strands of construction are brought together, very important from Arup's point of view. So stage one, the base is being built, and they start thinking what to do about the roof. And so these are the various schemes that they went through with Utzon to try and design the roof. And you have to realize, and Jack Zuntz would reinforce this a number of times in our discussions, was that in those days, the architect was the leader of the building team. So what the architect said, as far as the engineers were concerned, went. And so they spent 3 years, Jenkins mainly spent 3 years trying to work out how you could make the competition scheme stand up and retain the profile that Utzon had designed. So they up at the top, they're using shell structures, single skin shell structures. They drew parabolas. They experimented with ellipsoid geometry, single reinforced skins to start with. Then they saw the bending moments too great, so they started having 2 shells up to 1.2 meters apart, big structures. And so as you work down through this list of ways of doing it, they tried using steel. Jack Zuntz was really a steel person. He had been working in South Africa before he came to London to work on the Sydney Opera House. He'd done a lot of buildings in steel, and he knew how that worked. But when he suggested to Utzon that they could have a shell with a steel structure inside, Utzon didn't feel that that was quite honest use of materials, and so that was turned down. And so Jenkins worked on this for 3 years, and in the end he went to Arup and said he had to give up, he couldn't do it. And so that was when Jack Zuntz was brought in. They looked at different geometries. They talked about spherical geometries, toroidal geometries, and Utzon and Zuntz discussed the idea of prefabrication at the time, because that was how do you build a building of this scale with these structures? But at that stage, it was dismissed. So the engineers felt that the form and the structure as Utzon had designed it was sacrosanct. Now, looking back, the double skin version would have been much cheaper to construct than the final solution, which was a rib solution down. You can see down at the bottom, pretty solid ribs. That's the one which was built. And at a meeting in Arup's offices in 1961, which is a very, very, very key meeting, that in spite of the fact that actually selecting the rib version meant throwing away 3 years' work, Utzon said to Zuntz, "I don't care what it costs, what scandal it causes, but that's what I want." Very different to his competition entry, but nevertheless something that would actually stand up. So then they had to think about how they actually built that. because in the geometry that Utzon had, every section would be different. So actually casting the concrete would have been very hard. And this is where the aggravation, might say, between the engineers and the architects began. And so quite interesting, quite by chance, only the other day I came across these pictures of the Herder Aliyev Centre in Baku, designed by Zaha Hadid, and with Hanif Kara at AKT2 is the engineer, which is actually a steel structure with a shell fixed to the outside, which was of a that was thought to be too dishonest by Utzon, and which is why he didn't like it. So that's they ended up with the structure that you see there today, which is based on this circular geometry. Now, the way that Zuntz describes it is that for 6 months, they had meetings with Utzon talking about how you would prefabricate elements on so that you had similar angles to the prefabricated elements, so that you didn't have to make every single element at a different form and shape. So they discussed the idea of spherical or toroidal geometry that would actually give them a radius that was similar as you created each of the big beams that then made up the structure. So then one day Utzon rang up Jack Zuntz and said, "I've solved it." And he came up with this idea using, as you see, this circular sections which cut out of a larger sphere. So the aim would be that these would be cut out of a sphere of 246 feet radius. The ribs all followed the great circles of the sphere, and so they could be cast as repetitive elements, i.e. the circle was always of the same radius. And it changed, as you can see on the right, it changed the profile of the building quite radically from Utzon's initial competition scheme, but also very dangerously, it decreased the volume of the internal spaces, which became key later. But Utzon's claim that he had solved it, which he repeated for many years afterwards, this is what had really annoyed Jack Zuntz, because he said, "We've been discussing that for months." And so, he saw this as a collaborative project. Utzon saw it as his own, and that did cause a lot of tension. But I think they were all relieved that they had made a bit of progress. And so here is Jack Zuntz looking in the middle there, looking quite happy, Ashworth on the right, Utzon on the left, looking at the first document, which actually used the circle as the main geometry of the whole structure. But the problem was that designing a building with ribs rather than as a shell structure, that meant that it was very much heavier. And you remember I was saying that they had started construction of the base by that time. And so they realized that the columns that they'd put in the ground would not be anything like big enough to hold the new shells. So some of them, they had to increase the girth, add more concrete round the columns. Others, they had to blow the tops off, and some they had to get rid of altogether. And they did that. They started blowing them up during rush hour in Sydney because they thought they wouldn't be noticed because of the noise of the traffic, until somebody got a lump of concrete through their windscreen, and it was then, so I might say, out in the open. So anyway, the as the designs became more refined, we have the major hall at the bottom, And that was designed to have 2,800 people for symphony concerts and opera, sorry, for symphony concert. And then for opera, you would reduce it down to 1,800 using movable platforms. So the idea that it would be a multi-purpose hall which would have various movable parts that would make it suitable for those very different uses. At that stage, nobody thought there would be pop concerts in it, which actually started happening 3 months after the building opens, and that created a whole new set of problems. And the acoustic engineer was a chap called Wilhelm Lassen-Jordan. He was a very celebrated Danish acoustic engineer. He was a pioneer in acoustic modeling. And so he had major influence on this first scheme of Utzon's, which is fundamentally, it's not quite a rectangle, but it is based on the idea of the shoebox, which has traditionally been seen as the most successful acoustical shape, really, and which you find in the Vienna Musikverein or Boston Symphony Hall, Berlin Concert House. Those are really seen by musicians and audiences as being very successful forms. Later on in the project, Utzon was to bring in Lothar Kramer and Werner Gabler from the Berlin Institute of Technical Acoustics, because they'd been involved with Scharoun's Philharmonie, and Utzon became, he rather liked the vineyard approach of the boxes and the audiences around the stage rather than back from the stage here. And that was something that Utzon had to try and work on, of getting people further back behind the orchestra, because he couldn't fit enough seats in that area that you're seeing at the moment, which looks like the appropriate number, but actually wasn't. And of course, one of the issues around having a multi-purpose hall is that you have very different acoustic arrangements for concert and opera. So for concerts, Jordan was looking at 1.8 to 2 second reverberation, gives a richer sound. And for grand opera, where you need more clarity, 1.6 to 1.8 seconds. So you have to be able to vary the inside of the hall enough to generate those differences in reverberation time. And the way that Jordan did it, of course, now you just do that on a computer in a couple of seconds. They used 1 to 10 scale models, and they then speeded up the tape recordings of that in proportion to the scale to see what the effect of reverberation was within the forms. So as the whole project heated up, the Arup moved some people to, not a whole office, but some people to Sydney, and Utzon moved his whole office to Sydney. I mean, Arup had never really intended to open a Sydney office, although they did later. They were using MacDonald, Wagner and Priddle, who were the sort of big engineers in Australia at the time, as their representatives. And also the London partners of Arup were getting rather fed up with the job. Although it was highly prestigious, it was using up masses of time. They were losing money hand over fist, and it was beginning to really cost them, partly because they were producing a whole lot of drawings which they thought Utzon should have been producing, but never did, including all the drawings, as you can see, for the very complex shells, contract drawings they were delivering, as well as the tile drawings which go on the outside of many millions of tiles, all in those days drawn by hand. But also the whole situation was made more difficult by the fact that Utzon went AWOL as they were moving the office from Denmark to Sydney. He went traveling for 3 months. And in those days, if people were traveling, there's no way to get hold of them if they didn't want to be contacted. And so he was out of action for around 6 months, right in the crucial part of the project. And Arup had sent a chap called Michael Lewis, old friend of Zunz's, who was a sort of no-nonsense engineer. And he was traveling by land to Australia, had a nasty accident in Jerusalem, and he arrived a bit late. So there was the opening of the offices was somewhat chaotic, so at that stage, the job of Arup was really to monitor the construction of the shells, and Utzon was there to start designing the interiors. Now, the construction of the shells themselves, and this is Michael Lewis on the left there, with Ove Arup on site and Jack Zuntz on the right. And the shells themselves were obviously highly complex structures to erect, and but the plan was to do that in 2 years, and by which time Utzon was supposed to have had the interiors all ready then to be put in place. And so very interesting, one of the key people involved in the construction, on-site construction monitoring was Peter Rice, who became one of the most celebrated engineers of our day, and certainly in Arup. And so they started on site, and the first side shell to erect it took them a full 4 weeks to determine the precise position it should be in. And so they realized that if it was going to take them that long to put each panel in place, they wouldn't complete the project in their lifetime, let alone in 2 weeks. So they developed a computer program which determined the positions of all the various elements on site, and then they would survey that at the end of each day. The computer would run the results overnight, and they would then know exactly where to place the new elements in space, and the space was quite high up. Adjustments could be made accordingly. So it took them a bit of time to develop the program, but that actually didn't hold up construction, because there was a crane driver strike for 3 months at a very apposite moment. So they used the computers, and interesting enough, the Opera House is really the first building that at least a UK consultancy had used for construction. And so the Arup guys told me recently that the computer that they used to analyze the structure at the Opera House had 32 kilobytes of memory, which you might think is a bit funny these days. But now an engineer in Arup, their normal laptop would have 4 million kilobytes of memory, and their most powerful computer that they use for analysis now has at least 10 million times more power than the computer used on Sydney Opera House. So this obviously, when it took about 2 to 3 weeks, they went down to Southampton University to analyze it. It took 2 to 3 weeks for any design changes to be fed back into the structure, which was obviously a huge problem from a timescale. Of course, now their calculations, which would happen in literally in a millisecond. And so anyway, the Arup engineers were fairly frustrated that Utzon had been out of touch, but even more frustrated that when he came, he wanted to change a whole lot of things that they'd been doing in his absence. And Corbett Gore, who was the guy running Hornibrooks, who were the main contractors on site, described Utzon as being like Christopher Wren and wanting to change things as though concrete was like medieval masonry. So there was, quite a lot of, I'd say, frustrations from people on site wanting to get things done. Michael Lewis, as I say, fairly down-to-earth character. He said he could never understand why Utzon was treated like God. Why is everyone so seduced around here, he would say, which they were, because Utzon was charming. He was seen as a sort of local star, handsome. He was very good at greeting people, and he was generally very popular with the locals at that time. But then things started to go wrong as costs started to rise. So the first thing that happened was the Minister of Works took over responsibility for the job from the Sydney Opera House Executive Committee, and who had been very nice. And whenever Utzon asked for a check, a bit more money, the Executive Committee would send him another check. So the Minister of Works was not quite so generous, and they were expecting to see something for the money that they were paying out. The first minister was a chap called Norman Ryan, who had been at Joseph Kyle's deathbed and had this responsibility of fulfilling the Prime Minister's wishes to make sure that the Sydney Opera House was completed. But then in May 1965, he was Labour, and they were thrown out of office by the Liberal and Country Party, and they got into power on the ticket of getting the costs of the Opera House under control. And so the chap who became Minister for Works, this is a chap called Davis Hughes, who was a sort of hate figure for all those people who supported Utzon, because he was the guy who really, might say, got rid of Utzon from the project. So he started up a control by check system where Utzon would only be paid on the basis of the amount of work carried out, rather than those regular checks he was getting from the Executive Committee. Now, Utzon wanted to build these, you can see inside the main theatre, under the shells, there is this big sort of slightly zigzag ceiling, which Utzon wanted to build out of large sections of plywood. There was a very advanced plywood manufacturer called Simmons, who could also laminate plywood to various metals. And he was looking at it wouldn't be totally gold, but it would be painted gold or with gold leaf, but to give this curvy linear shape, which focused down on the stage. And they were very large. The engineers were worried that they might actually pull the shells down. The contractors didn't think they could actually even get them onto site, but Utzon was insisting, and he wanted to build a prototype and was asking for money for it. So he also wanted to do the same thing for the window, which overlooks Sydney Harbour, and this is the window he designed. We'll see pictures later as it turned out slightly differently. So Utzon, though, at the time, he wanted money to build a prototype, but he was also running out of money because he was insisting that he couldn't do any drawings if he didn't build the prototypes, and the Prime Minister wouldn't, or the Ministry of Works wouldn't pay him until he'd done the drawing. So he was in a catch-22 situation, and so he'd hoped the minister would pay some $60,000 for one of the prototypes, and that just wasn't possible. So, as I say, without the prototypes, he wouldn't proceed with the drawings. Without the drawings, Hughes, the minister, was able to stop payments. So Utzon went to see Davis Hughes to have this out with him on, it was February the 6th, 1966. And so they started discussing fees. Hughes said he'd look into it. So Utzon said, well, if you don't do something about it quickly, I'm going to resign. Hughes said, that's no way to speak to a minister of the Crown. And so Utzon walked out, and then later that afternoon sent a letter saying to the minister, you have forced me to leave the job. And he told the minister he had dismissed his staff, which at that stage, and I spoke to Davis Hughes, I mean, he'd retired, and I spoke to him in his retirement home, and he said we thought he had resigned. But Utzon fairly soon afterwards claimed that he didn't mean he'd resigned, although I think anyone reading the minutes of that meeting would suggest the minister was probably right. But a chap called Bill Wheatland, who was one of the senior people within Utzon's office, was with him at the time and said, Utzon said, "Don't worry, I bet they'll come running after me." But they didn't. So there was quite a fuss about this, because students and local architects felt that Utzon should be kept on. Many felt that Arup should have resigned at the same time if Utzon was going, but Utzon said there was no way we could walk away from a contract where the client had treated us so well. Michael Lewis thought resignation shouldn't even be contemplated. Arup at first wanted to resign, but then changed his mind. And Hughes said to me when I met him in his 80s, he said, if Arup had resigned, I would have had to resign as minister as well. So, there was a lot hanging on what happened. Harry Seidler, then I guess the leading architect in Australia, very much sided with Utzon and carried on a campaign against Arup for most of the rest of his career, that they shouldn't be operating in Sydney, although Arup did actually have a fairly successful number of years in their office there. So, but Utzon left Sydney secretly and never to return, and has never, until he died, had never seen his building complete. Arup wrote at the time, the indisputable fact is that I, and that goes for most members of the firm, have lost confidence in Utzon, and without this, we could not resign on his behalf. But he said that didn't conflict with his earlier description of Utzon as the best architect I've ever worked with in terms of space, form, texture, color, and light. And so Arup was only met Utzon once more in his life. He tried to go and meet him in Denmark, and one of the members of the Arup team, who was friendly with Utzon, left Arup in a hotel near the office, went to Utzon's office, said, "Will you meet Ove?" And he refused to see him. And it was only then when Utzon received the Royal Gold Medal in 1977 that they shook hands and exchanged pleasantries, and that was all. So great relationship for a time. Very sadly, it was destroyed by the Opera House. So this is what it looked like when Utzon resigned, and the photographs were taken by Peter Hall, who was commissioned by the government then to take on the job of delivering the interiors. And Peter Hall was 34. He was seen as one of the sort of leading young designers in the country, and he thought that he was being hired to oversee the execution of Utzon's scheme, which Utzon had claimed at the time was fully designed. And he was given a bit of backup. This is Hall on the left, and the firm of Hall, Todd and Littlemore was set up. That's Todd on the right, Littlemore in the middle. And they were the official architects for stage 3 of the Opera House, which, as I said, was the delivery of the interiors. Hall did things very professionally. He wrote to Utzon saying, "The ministers assured me that your services have been properly terminated." And then he went to look at the drawings, and when they went to collect the drawings, their response was the cupboard was almost bare. Utzon's architects had kept 5,000 of the more recent drawings, and these didn't actually emerge until 1973, after the building had been completed and opened. And maybe they had taken them as a sort of bargaining chip if Utzon came back. But then, they had not been delivering any drawings that were actually used on site. So it didn't actually stop the progress either on site or in terms of preparing for the interiors to be put in. But the scheme, as it was left, was then looked at by some of the people who would have to use it. A chap called Warwick McAfee, who was the consultant to ABC, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. He criticised it. He said, not enough seats, no space for broadcasting cables, too much noise from the harbour. Ted Farmer's a government architect, said seating layout not drawn accurately, capacity unknown, acoustic design not possible, no contact with the fire brigade, and the seating shown in Utzon's drawings would be illegal, no proper provision of stormwater drains, no provision of cabling for power, audio, lighting, television, no solution for the construction of the glass or walls after 10 years. And the Sydney Opera, who were, they were going to be using a concert hall, were really, I guess, the key clients, said it was inadequate. So it needed pretty radical rethinking. And Peter Hall went off on a world tour. And one of the very interesting buildings he went to see was this one by Kunio Maekawa, the Saitama Concert Hall, which has this plywood interior, which is not dissimilar in terms of the approach that Utzon was taking for the interiors, but this convinced Hall that Utzon's basic idea of using the concrete structure as a background and against that the plywood interiors was the way to go forward. But after visiting a lot of the concert halls around the world, decided these multi-purpose halls just didn't work. And so he changed the whole layout of the opera house, that proposed that the minor hall should just be used for opera and the major hall should be a concert theatre only. So really he turned the whole thing on its head. And Arup remained as engineers, and much later Utzon was to say, luckily Ove Arup stayed on the job, otherwise it would never have been completed. They got rid of Utzon's idea of building plywood glass walls, and they designed a steel version. They were very complex, those end walls, because the geometry changes from semicircle, it's one radius to another one of another radius, then it has to come in and fit into the base underneath. So very, very complex operation and very cutting edge at the time. Nothing had been built anywhere in the world, actually. So everything from adhesives to mastic and the way that glass was held up was pretty cutting edge. So in the end, Hall completed the interior, I think very magnificently, actually. He used white birch to do it. It has a certain feel of Utzon's ideas, but and it uses, say, the vineyard. You can see those boxes around the edge of the orchestra there, that vineyard approach, which Kramer had used in the Philharmonie in Berlin. And with some, there is some acoustical flexibility in those flat mushroom-shaped sections above the orchestra. And at the time, it was generally thought of, the acoustics weren't too bad. And but over the years, it was generally, there are other places which overtook it, and they wanted to improve the quality of it. And anyway, came across this very recently, really. Hall was a very tragic figure, and died too young. But this was while he was on his travels, looking at different solutions. And so he went to see Utzon in Hellebeck, where his office was, and quite difficult to read on screen, I'm sure, but it was basically, he said that Utzon suggested they might get together and work on the project. But by that time, really, there was no chance that the client would have accepted to have him back. So the Queen then opened the building in October the 20th, 1973, 16 years after Utzon won the competition. And then everything went a bit quiet. As I said, one of the big surprises was that they started having pop concerts, and pop concerts they hadn't expected to be something, and that needed a totally different acoustic requirements. And then in 1994, there was an exhibition called Unseen Utzon, and this was put together by supporters of Utzon who had not stopped supporting him. They thought that Hall's interior should be ripped out and Utzon's be put in there, and they had an exhibition where they showed that they said he had solved all the problems, but Australian architect Ken Woolley, who's written a very studious book on what Utzon produced, said that there was no drawing in that exhibition which could be called a working drawing, which would deliver anything. But that raised the interest in trying to get Utzon back to see how the next stage of repairs and alterations to the building should be undertaken. And soon after the Unseen Utzon exhibition, 1995, Hall died. He was by that time destitute. He was alcoholic. He had literally been destroyed by the, I would say probably by the architectural profession in Australia, who had in the main supported Utzon and had castigated Hall for his involvement. So the one thing Unseen Utzon did was to actually get people in the idea. So what would Utzon do to improve the opera house going forward? Because over the next few hundred years it will change, and so it was thought that he should be brought back to have some sort of engagement with how the building might be changed. And so they brought in his son, Jan. Jan had actually been brought up for some of his youth in Sydney, and he'd done 2 years at the New South Wales Department of Architecture, and so was familiar with Sydney. And although Utzon refused to go back to Sydney, they even tried to get Kerry Packer's jet to go to Mallorca and pick him up and fly him to Sydney, but he wouldn't do it. But Richard Johnson, who was the architect taken on to try and drive through an idea of delivering Utzon principles for change, was Richard Johnson. He went to Carnlees, which is Utzon's wonderful house in Mallorca, and showed Utzon the proposal, and Utzon read it, and he looked up and he said, "Wouldn't it have been marvelous if the Acropolis had had such a document?" So I think he saw the Sydney Opera House similar, role as the Acropolis, but Richard Johnson realised that he had by then bought into the idea that by delivering his principles, it would be good for the future of the building. And Utzon told journalist Anne Nicholson at the time, and a lot of people say, well, why didn't he want to go back to Australia? He said he didn't want to go back there because there would be too much argument about the rights and wrongs of the interiors. But he said to Anne Nicholson, "Of course, when I left, I thought they would call me back. I have the opera house in my head like a composer has his symphony, who can go at any time, go into the symphony and hear it." So he can go and visit the building untainted by all the changes that happened afterwards as he saw it. So they started work with Richard Wilson and with Jørn Utzon, and they added this western colonnade onto the side, and that leads into what is now called the Utzon Room. and this is interesting because it's often said, well, this is the only room in the whole of the Opera House actually now which is designed by Utzon, because he selected the mural there, he selected the materials for the floor, but of course what he didn't actually select was the roof, that is the roof which we looked at earlier, which OBE Arup designed, and which Utzon was so keen on at the time. So I guess this is the one which brings those two together, representing, I'd say, a lasting reminder of the close relationship between two great men. And then in 2012, the Opera has announced a decade of renewal, which was to bring it up to modern standards in time for the 50th anniversary, which started at the end of last year and runs up until the end of this year. This was, a once-in-a-generation upgrade. They spent 300 million on it, and culminated in the, sorry, that's that little roof again, culminated in the completion of the concert hall by Arms Architects, which is Ashton Raggett McDoodle, and they were commissioned to fix the acoustics, improve functionality, improve accessibility, and they delivered these, you can just see them, these sort of pink donuts hanging over the stage there. Sort of 18 new petal-shaped reflectors, and they can provide direct and early reflections to the musicians on stage so that they hear themselves better, and also the audience do too. So the stage was dropped quite a bit, so you could have this arrangement. This arrangement, which is if it's a pop concert, you have that, and there are various. You can see up above where the band is. Those pink curtains will change the acoustics, and then you go into the orchestral mode, choir behind, and the petal shapes changed in their position above. And in terms of access, they put in lifts, because one of the great things about the Greek form of the theatres meant that the staircases ran along the outside of the seating, and so it was very accessible. It made a good fire escape. It was actually very logical and accessible, but it did mean that everybody had to go up two flights of stairs of 50 risers, which wouldn't be acceptable today, I don't think, for disabled access. So now they have lifts, can do that. The Opera House next door, that is quite tight. As I said, one of the problems of having the stairs either side is it restricts the width, and they do ballet in there. They have to put mattresses on the walls, because ballet dancers shoot off stage. They are likely to smash themselves into the walls if they're not careful. And the choruses in Aida have to queue around the block to get onto stage. So logistically, it's pretty much of a nightmare. But to end with, I think that Utzon was, as I said, he was happy that OBE Arup stayed on. They didn't fully make it up, but nevertheless, generally people are much more relaxed about the whole saga since. And I like this photograph because it does actually bring out one of Utzon's, what Utzon felt was one of his great successes in the buildings, was the tiles on the outside. The use of sort of variegated finish to the tiles creates this wonderful light, which I think is the apotheosis of Louis Kahn's quote: "The sun never knew how great it was until it hit the side of a building," and probably this is the greatest building that it has hit the side of. And just before he died, Utzon accepted that the building can change and other hands can have a go at it. And so he felt less resentful about Hall's work. And so he actually wrote, "I can say that I'm very happy that so much with the Sydney Opera House has succeeded, and that the architects taking the work after me, Hall, Todd and Littlemore, with the aid of OBE Arup's company, has made the building function so well. Arup's office is, of course, of key importance, as they know where things are, what parts of the building can take certain loads, and what has been hung in different places. The way the walls, materials, etc., which are important to the total structure of the house, have been constructed and applied." Even local architects did soften their view slightly, and in 2006, the Australian Institute of Architects awarded Hall their 25-year award in recognition of what they called the opera as among the major achievements of Australian architects of the 1960s and 70s. And a year or so before Utzon died, he rang Jack Zuntz out of the blue, and they had a long and affable conversation. So generally, as I said at the beginning, all's well that ends well. And to a certain extent, what has ended so well is the wider impact of Sydney Opera House. It is the image of Australia. It's very important, I think, to the country and its identity. And as I'm sure members of DocoMomo know only too well, of course, over time, cost and all the issues around cost, that disappears, and people only remember the quality of the architecture. The original estimated cost for the Sydney Opera House was 9,624,000 Australian dollars. And its final cost was 102 million Australian dollars, increase of 10 times the original estimate. But as part of the 40th anniversary, Deloitte delivered a report that estimated the value of the Opera House was 4.6 billion, underlining the sort of scale of the windfall that Australia has reaped from the vision of the daring, iconic structure. But it did have a lot of ramifications for, I think, the architectural profession, perhaps more than anything. One, architectural competitions in this country almost faded off the scene. They became very unpopular, a bad way, it was thought, to choose an architect. The whole idea of project management started to come in, and Zuntz says that without Sydney Opera House, project managers would not be in the role they are today in UK construction, because people realised that Utzon did no site drawings at all. It was all done by the engineers, i.e. at that stage, Arup had become de facto project managers. It also did reinforce stereotypes about architects. Architect is someone who keeps changing everything and pays little attention to cost, and that, I think, was not great. Harry Seidler, who I've mentioned a number of times, he said that the Australians, with their Anglo-Saxon background, didn't really understand, because Harry Seidler was a European. Harry Seidler said that the Australians didn't understand the European sensibility, where, as with cathedrals, quality was more important than expediency. So, I mean, it was a conflict between pragmatists and aesthetes. I think it was a nail in the coffin for the leadership of the architect in the profession, and it was the rise of the icon. And so after that, everyone wanted one, from Bilbao to Burj Khalifa. And then just a little short footnote, this is the Kuwait Parliament building, which Utzon designed in 1972. He won a competition which was assessed by Sir Leslie Martin. But Sir Leslie Martin only said he could have the job as long as he had an executive architect to help deliver it, which he did, and it was delivered and rebuilt after the Kuwaiti War. But here is the building today, amazing icon, and it was very good value. At $100 million then would be $770 million today. that's the equivalent of £423 million. So not too bad really, when you think that the City of London was about to spend about 288 million on a single concert hall by Diller and Scofidio just round the corner. So it was good value. It went through huge ructions. It impacted on people's lives. Many of those involved with it, and it was the greatest thing they did. And some, like Peter Hall, it destroyed absolutely. So an amazing building. It's amazing for the country, but an amazing piece of architecture too. So thank you very much. Sorry, that was much too long, I think. But
this is the Docomomo, so we don't have to do sound bites and short attention spans here. If there are any questions out there in the virtual world of Zoom, please put them in the chat, and we'll bring them to Peter. So please do that. I'm sure there's some questions out here as well. So who's going to set us off? Rob. Are Arup still involved in the building? They must be the only people who know.
Yes, yes, they've been working with ARM on the concert hall, which had quite a lot of structural issues to deal with, because they have to put a lot of heavy kit up into the roof. So it is quite important, as Utzon said, that they know where everything's hidden, really. And I think that one of the issues around changing the space, which is now the Opera Theatre, is that the architects want to drop the stage there and drop the orchestra pit. And there's a whole lot of post-tensioning underground there. And so everyone's worried that somebody's going to snip through something that they shouldn't, and the wings of the building would fly away if they're careful. But yes, Arup are still involved. I think that most of the people who were really vituperative about Arup's role have now passed on. So I think generally, the tone is a lot softer than it was. Well, I think that it was felt that particularly the minister was from the Country Party, so he was seen as somebody who wasn't a suitable judge on architectural quality. They thought that Utzon was being pushed out by bureaucracy, too much cost control, whereas actually, I mean, in my view, there were a whole series of issues that Utzon found it very difficult to solve, and therefore actually giving up was one way out of that. I mean, he hadn't been able to fit in the required number of seats, as I said earlier. But when you get into that situation, there's nothing they could do, and that was the problem of having the two theatres side by side, which Boissevain said at the beginning was fatally flawed. There's no way he could expand outwards. When they moved to the ribbed solution, they then, the big ribs, it just reduces the space inside. The amount of space for legs was seen to be critical, and I don't know whether Australians are taller than Danes, but anyway, there was a lot of toing froing about what the ideal leg room would be. And so said as Hall, when he was traveling the world, he traveled the world with a tape measure, and he measured everything from legroom in airplanes to all the theatres he went to see what was the ideal. And they also had a layout of seats, which meant that access was from either side where the stairs were, and you came straight in there was no aisle down the middle of the seats, which meant you needed a little bit extra legroom, because you had all the people coming in late would tread on your toes.
Not a question, it's an observation. So fantastic story behind it. As you were going through this, I think I knew some of it, know all of it, and the controversy that surrounded it. Thank you. Should I do that again?
Not a question, but an observation. A great story, wonderful story, and the creation of an amazing building. And in a way, I suppose the point I was really going to say was that whilst I knew some of the controversy, not all of it, it seems somehow fitting that when there's a bold political vision to create a new iconic, I'll use that word advisedly, iconic structure that almost defines a nation, which it really does, that somehow when all the technology, all the design, everything is pushed and pushed and pushed, you don't really expect a painless birth, I suppose. And out of that come many lessons about how you do these things for the future. But, I'd just say, I've never been, and it's on my bucket list, but it's one that, absolutely want to go and see. And it's one of the most extraordinary things that has ever been created. So thank you for shining a light on so much of it. It was extraordinary.
Hi, fantastic talk. Thank you so much. Where was the requirement set here? I'm thinking of the Bastille Opera competition data, which was incredibly detailed, and effectively it just involved putting a skin on a predetermined theatre and backstage shape. You didn't mention who was informing all of this on the client side.
Yes, well, I mean, that was one of the big criticisms that the Utzon supporters would make, and I think Arup would go along with it, that the brief was not really as detailed as required. I mean, the actual competition brief it's about 12 pages. Most of it was around building regulations and photographs of the site, and just a list of the things that went into the different halls. So I think there was inadequate brief at the beginning. There were lots of questions over the actual management of the executive committee, who were actually dealing with Utzon on a regular basis. And so I think that I mean, if I had another hour, I could have gone through some of that, but I think that was a key issue as well. The brief wasn't properly developed at the initial stage, and that fundamental idea that you could get the quality of acoustics they wanted out of having a multi-purpose hall. There's nowhere in the world. There are a couple in Japan and a couple in the States where you have panels that move around all over the place. But I think Mikawa, who was one of the architects, who actually a Japanese architect who worked on the Opera House and then went back to Japan and built a multi-purpose hall, even he admitted that the solution there was rather echoey. Hall, when he went round and looked at everything, decided that multi-purpose halls weren't the answer.
All right, thanks very much. And one more question. Did any of the 5,000 drawings, they were recovered, did any of those help to inform ARM's work?
No, there were very few drawings. ARM's work, yes. Oh, yes. Well, they were available to see what Utzon had wanted, but to a certain extent, I guess they weren't that helpful, apart from understanding his basic, might say, parameters, because as I said, he couldn't fit in the number of seats, and he didn't, and he was designing, because he was designing the multi-purpose hall, he was designing something different. So I would say that it's always instructive to look at the way people put drawings together, particularly as in those days, you know, they were all hand drawn. So yeah, leafing through those drawings is very instructive to look at the design process. But I think fundamentally, since most of the stuff that they were working on was the interiors, which had then been really finished by Hall, and they, as you might have seen, they didn't change the basic interior of the main concert hall at all. They used Hall's plywood interior, but just adapted it with hanging curtains and a few additional panels.
And did did Peter Hall have any overlap at all with Utzon? Any clues, anything to go on for his work?
So overlap with
Utzon. Did Peter Hall have any overlap with him? Any?
He went to see him sometime later as a visit in the diary, but all the Utzon staff, and it was Bill Wheatland, it's thought, who took the 500 drawings and hid them away in Sydney, was not at all cooperative to Peter Hall. And when the chairman of the Sydney Opera House thought they should start talking to Utzon again back in the late 90s, he consulted both with Utzon's family, Jan and Lynn, but also with the architects who had worked on the project. And to a man, the architects who worked on the project said all Hall's interiors should be ripped out and what we designed put in instead. But the Opera House felt that was a bit drastic, and there was no evidence that they could have actually, again, fitted in the seats. And the number of seats was important because I can't remember the precise figures now, but the orchestra used to play in Sydney Town Hall, and I think they had 2,000 something or other seats, and they needed slightly more seats to be able to make it sensible for them to move economically into the Opera House. But then they, when they realized Utzon wasn't delivering the numbers, if they'd said, oh, well, we can't move into the Opera House because you haven't got enough seats, then what the Australians would have now would be a fantastic sculpture, but nothing inside it, really. Right. And there were people at the time when, because they had to wait, really 3 years for the interiors to be done. There were a lot of people who said just leave the concrete up there like that and don't bother to build the interior.
Wow. Okay. Do you personally consider? I mean, I consider him a genius. I mean, he's right up there. The 1960s, when I grew up, all I can remember is the Opera House. This is as a relatively young, 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old. The Opera House and the Apollo space program seems to be my image of the 1960s.
Yes, true. Yes, I certainly remember the
but do you
space
think
program.
Do you think would you rate him a genius in architectural terms? Something completely unique.
Well, I think he was a brilliant architect, but out of his depth, basically.
Well, yeah, it must have been
because
stressful.
if you look at the way he, for instance, designed Carnlees, his house in Mallorca, it was about sitting on a stone, contemplating the view, and moving the stones around to make the window, and that sort of works when you're designing a house. And I think the Kinko houses and are great.
I assume you've been to Basviar Church in Copenhagen.
Yes.
I mean, that's just
brilliant.
My children almost collapsed, having refused to come. They then grudgingly came.
Yeah.
And the silence when they walked into the building was only equaled by their visit to Sagrada Familia.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that is still a brilliant building. They only did half of it, really, and yes, and I'm never sure about genius, but using the word genius, but yeah, he's brilliant. But the issues, why didn't he have it? Lots of very good Danish engineers. Why didn't he, do his competition with an engineer? Why didn't Saarinen look at it and think, well, this might, because he'd done quite a lot of shell structures before, so well, this isn't going to stand up. Why did Arup and actually Duncan Michaels, who was later become a chairman of Arup, he was quoted as saying, you know, I could never understand why Arup himself, who was, you know, running the firm, it was a relatively small firm, had Jenkins working for 3 years on the structure without telling Jenkins, you know, let somebody else, if you can't do it, let somebody else do it. And Jenkins was a mathematician, fairly isolated from others in the office, and you know, that went on far too long, and somebody should have sorted it out earlier.
Should they have widened the promontory to make the buildings fit?
That would have made life a lot easier, but you know, actually, I mean, Utzon did even his competition drawings. He widened the promontory, and that was actually against the. That was one of the things which is in the brief that you couldn't do that, but he did it anyway, and they ignored him at the time. And there is a bit sticking out which isn't there in the. Sorry. So that he's added a bit more to it, but so
Thank you.
pleasure.
Stuff. Well, I do have a comment from online
Great.
from Kate McIntosh,
Oh,
who had went to a talk by Sam Wanamaker, who directed the first production, he said, of the which was War and Peace by Prokofiev, and Sam Wanamaker said that the orchestra pit was so restricted that half the players sat under the stage on the machinery of the revolve, and apparently all due to lack of wing space. So that was sort of confirmed by a director there. I must say, I think Keith has summed up a sort of response beautifully. No, it's not my job. And but I would like to thank Peter for just a extraordinarily concise story told from an enormously complex amount of material. So it really has been what I think Docomomo tries to do, is to bring to life the sort of documentation of those projects that have created what we see as modern architecture. So I'm really grateful to you. Thank you very much,